Uh, Great. So welcome at the second session of today PhilosophyCon, and in its schedule there are four speakers: Mark Cinkiewicz, Mika Phillips-Gary, Cassandra Gritzner, and Matthew Gladden. And the first speaker is Mark Cinkiewicz. I'm pleased to announce his speech entitled "How to Kill Monster with a Plasma Cutter." Mark?
Yes, thank you very much. So my name is Mark. I'm an interdisciplinary researcher from Belarus, based in Warsaw. I'm a PhD student at the University of Warsaw and a researcher at the New Center for Research and Practice. My work is connected with the colonial approach on issues of nuclear colonization, media studies, and theory of monsters. But today I will be talking about computer games and monsters. And the title of my presentation is How to Kill a Monster with a Plasma Cutter. Let me start with an idea of reverse horror. Reverse horror approach in computer games allows players to walk into the shoes of monstrous foes. Rather than being prompted to annihilate, a player is offered a chance to reverse this fundamental antagonism of monsters. Recently, release of reverse horror game like Carry On, and also older games like Black Ink, where we play for a virus trying to kill the entire planet, or Prototype, where a person can have different kinds of weapons from his own body morphing into weapons, and many other offer an opportunity to take a closer look at the phenomenon of inhabiting a monstrous body or non-body. However, monster studies quickly came upon an unexpected and curious contradiction. The contradiction resides in the way monster studies and video game monster studies view monsters. In brief, monster studies have for a long time been informed and relied heavily upon Kant's sublime thesis. For Kant, an object that evokes the sublime does so because it appears to be ill-adapted to our faculty of presentation and does violence to our imagination. Therefore, monsters evoke feelings that are brought about by radical otherness. Another important aspect is called radical vulnerability. For asthma, it refers to the danger of being crushed by a monster whose power is beyond ours and is difficult to understand. The sublime thesis and its implications have been fundamental for monstrosity research. However, the definitions that stemmed from this basis vary due to a great degree of interdisciplinarity in the field. In particular, a philosopher Richard Kearney describes monsters as the ultimate other, whose otherness occupies the frontier zone where the reason flutters and the fantasies flourish. In his description, monsters are closely tied to humans in that they are tokens of fracture within the human psyche. What Kearney attempts to capture in his definition of monsters as the tokens of fracture is that they are transgressive, contradictory, mad, obscene. Timothy Beale identifies the main quality, property of a monster to be its ability to disrupt one's sense of at-homeness. By disturbing the at-homeness, he means that monsters threaten one's security, stability, integrity, and well-being, and even meaning. They make one feel not at home. Monsters, in essence, reveal insecurities about one's world, one's society, one's face. On the same note, Asa and Mittman, philosophers, claim that the unsettlement is at the core of monstrosity. Unsettlement is brought about by the otherness so radical that it is hard to describe and categorize. With the lack of categories and descriptions, monsters bring the radical blend. They immerse one into the state of cognitive vertigo. Noel Carroll, for example, in his definition, also brings up the issue of vertigo in connection to the category jamming. Monsters translate familiar categories into the unfamiliar through category jamming, like, for example, werewolf or Frankenstein. Sheldrick, for example, thinks of the ability of monsters to disrupt, jam, and transgress in relation to the very thing which is to be disrupted, namely normality. For monsters, can threaten and undermine normality. I gave you the most notable definitions of monstrosity encountered in research literature, except Yulia Kristeva's object, but I will come back to this notion again later. Otherwise, all the definitions describe monsters as figures of radical vertigo, unsettlement, transgression, something that does not respect borders, rules, something that cannot be classified. Monsters always escape categorization through being contradictory, obscene, mad. The most exciting thing happens when we change the medium of interacting with monsters. What happens if we immerse monsters in the training ground for our control societies, video games? The power of computer games is not to be underestimated here. It's crucial to understand that the control video games establish over monsters is beyond mere panopticon. It is true that in video games, like in surveillance systems, the hidden is to be revealed and the dangerous is to be eliminated. But video games go beyond that. First of all, monsters in games are basically a set of data. They have particular abilities and limitations that overdetermine them on algorithmic level. Algorithms contain exhaustive information about monsters, like the number of health points, mana points, armor, attack volume, move speed, attack speed, agility, strength, intellect, behavior in fights, reaction delay, everything. Video game monsters are a priori determined, classified, systematized. Algorithms have complete control over beasts that inhabit them. Algorithms present us with the possibility of obtaining a totalizing vision over gaming monsters because they are reducible to discrete information units. It appears to be a perfect realization of the cybernetic drive described by Gungeon, where we have total control over a world reduced to calculable mechanical operations. Here is where the conflict happens, because while the sublime thesis emphasizes the impossibility of the monster to become an object, this is what video game algorithms do. Monsters are driven by algorithms and statistics, which conform to the rules of each game. Video games, however, make the player face the monster. Monsters become objects of players' action, and the rules of the game are clearly defined and ready to be scrutinized. What we are witnessing is a major shift in the way we conceptualize monstrosity. The logic of informatic control has now colonized even the things we fear, our monsters, previously deemed to be inscrutable and object. What Schvelz says is basically that monsters are getting presented in fully observable, embodied form. In games, we can interact, kill, eliminate, and destroy monsters. Indexicalization of gaming monsters objectifies what previously has been slippery, transgressive, and object. At the beginning of my talk, I claimed that monsters evoke feelings that are brought about by radical otherness. Now, as we know that the radical otherness of gaming monsters is objectified, classified, contained, and overdetermined by algorithms, what is left is the referring feeling. This feeling is objection, and it is always embodied. Yulia Kristeva, a philosopher, offers a peculiar approach to monsters with the help of the notion of objection. In her book, Power of Horrors, monsters are defined as something that disturbs identity, system, and order, something that does not respect borders and rules, the in-between, the ambiguous, the composite. Kristeva describes object as anything that disturbs conventional identity and the border between subject and object. For her, monster is the radical unsettlement that involves the collapse of the other in the self. In this scenario, monstrous other becomes a part of the self. On the same note, Svelte argues that the process of objection is vital to constructing the monster as undefinable or resisting ontological delineation through Kristeva's distinguishing the object from an object. The former is not definable. It is not an object facing me, which I name or imagine. However, again, computer games possess precisely the power to objectify, define, and systematize monsters. The question then, is there a space for objection in this scenario, or are video game monsters stripped of their fundamental characteristics? To answer this question, I would like to reintroduce the idea of reverse horror to demonstrate the dynamics at play in relation to objection and algorithmic containment of monsters. First of all, let me shed the light on this concept and explain how reverse horror works with algorithms. A reverse horror is an approach to diversify processes of character embodiment, meaning to allow player to take up the role of a monster. Reverse horror in a game like Carry On, for example, where an alien-like creature escapes from a laboratory and you are playing for this creature, represents axiological alignment with otherness. What is most interesting about this approach is what Jaroslav Svelch noticed in his exploration of the game Dead Space 2 and marketing campaign they had. It featured middle-aged women who represented gamers' mothers. In this campaign, they were shown the most disturbing and violent moments of the Dead Space 2 game. And as Jaroslav Svelch explained, they hated it and they wondered, why would anybody make a game like that? Why would anybody play a game like that? However, such an impression is only possible if one has no actual gameplay experience. The disgust and the lack of understanding among these people who are expected to be gamer moms are indeed pronounced, but it is explained by the fact that they meet monsters in a way different from the way their supposed children meet monsters, because their supposed children meet monsters with plasma cutter in their hands, which makes the experience of meeting the monster completely different. I would go as far as to claim that the same applies to the reverse horror scenarios. When playing as a monster, a player would usually engage in rampaging human enemies. However, one has no feeling of horror when killing humans in the game, nor reflection, nor emotional involvement, nor after reflection. On the contrary, these games are described to be fun and enjoyable. Dysmorphism appears to be prosthetic, allowing for new ways of moving as the monster, of new ways of killing that player takes advantage of. What it signals is that the absence of objection characterizes the gameplay experience. It happens because algorithms make a player face or inhabit a monster's body or not body. When becoming objectified, embodied, scrutinized, defined, and acted upon, the new indexialized monsters are no longer inscrutable and object enough to subvert the logic of informatic control that permeates them through algorithms in video games. So are these new, knowable, non-object monsters that we encounter in computer games are actually monsters, even though they no longer possess the characteristics formerly regarded as essential for monsters? The answer would be most likely yes. The new medium, however, computer games, offer a major conceptual shift. Unlike those previously encountered, the new, defeatable, targetable monsters are just rule-based. Their mystery is misspelled to a degree. The new medium that upholds video games based on logical operations and numerical representation no longer allow monsters to be contradictory or blurred enough to evoke objection. Monsters can be disgusting and horrific, but their behavior is still dictated and overdetermined by analyzable and describable algorithms. Nevertheless, algorithms do not stop gaming monsters from being monsters. The dynamics in play in Monstrosity identified above are far from unique. We should not be too quick in attempting to come up with an exhaustive interpretation. So before jumping to a conclusion, I want to make a brief historical overview of the attempts to explain monstrosity to put my argument in perspective. Over the centuries, there were numerous attempts to explain monstrosity or to normalize the marvelous. In the 18th, 19th centuries, monsters were brought to laboratories and ended up under the scientific scalpel in scientist's jar. And it was claimed that there are no exceptions to the law of nature, there are only exceptions to the law of naturalists. At the end of the 19th century, it became clear that variations of human morphology are relatively limited. Many cases of embodied monstrosity were rendered explainable, understandable, normal. Monstrosity of form was no longer carrying this threat of monstrousness. So visual monstrosity started losing its prominence a little bit. It has been rendered, it was expected that it was rendered transparent. So monstrosity, with the help of Michel Foucault, for example, was relocated from visual domain into behavioral domain, making it visually unidentifiable. But these historical examples that demonstrate that when something about monsters get exposed, or we get to know something new about monsters, or some aspect is rendered transparent, it leads to the assumption that monstrosity vanishes. However, it does not mean that if gaming monsters are fully contained within algorithms, they are devoid of their monstrosity. The loss of such abilities as of a monster as disorientation, vertigo, transgression, abjection, disruption do not mean that monsters are no longer monstrous. Neither does it mean that gaming monsters are not fully monsters. Not only gaming monsters continue to be monsters, but the same characteristics that we name as no longer partaking in the formation of gaming monsters are also still capable of returning in the future through a different medium. It has happened to visual monstrosity that vanished for a few decades but is making a return again. To conclude, we should be careful to celebrate the new definition of monstrosity in video games because by their nature, monsters are slippery enough to make any encyclopedist nervous. What is crucial to understand here is that the critical element of monstrosity being its ability to keep emerging in our discursive scene and to hunt our imagination and our scientific knowledge claims. And these features stay in act. Monsters that were previously deemed inscrutable and abject are changing, so the new monsters have been subjected to the logic of informatic control, while at the same time continuing to hunt our scientific knowledge claims. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot. We will have a time for discussion after all the speeches. As I can see, just Mika joined us. Mika, can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. So let me introduce you with your speech. So Mika Phillips-Gary will present a paper entitled The Phenomenology of Kipple. Mika, let's go.
Okay. Can you see the presentation?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay. Hello, my name is Micah Phillips-Gary. Today I'm going to give a presentation on the concept of Kipple, introduced by Philip K. Dick in his novel Directive of Electric Sheep, from a phenomenological standpoint. So the basic idea of Kipple is that Kipple's useless objects, like junk mail or match folders after you use the last match, or gum wrappers, or yesterday's homeopath. So at first glance, we might want to think about Kipple as just sort of, the term Kipple is just sort of equivalent to junk or trash. And I mean, that's certainly not wrong, but I think that there's a certain connotation that junk or trash has that is lacking in Kipple, which is important, which is to say that, you know, if I say to you, you know, look at all the junk or look at all the trash you have lying around, implicit in that is the idea that, well, you should do something about it. You should, you know, throw it away or something like this. So even junk or trash, there's something to be done with it. It's something to be thrown out. Whereas Kipple is just useless. There's nothing to be done with it. When we think about an object as Kipple, we aren't thinking about anything to do with it. It's just there in a certain way. So in addition to this basic concept of Kipple, we get certain claims being made about Kipple. The first of which, and the one which I'm mostly going to focus on, is this idea that when nobody's around, Kipple reproduces itself. So that is, in the absence of human intervention, if you leave Kipple in an environment, then everything else in that environment is going to become Kipple. Now, obviously, the way in which it puts here, it's sounds a little bit absurd, like, like if I leave a bunch of candy wrappers on the floor, there's going to be more candy wrappers in the morning. But I think clearly the more charitable way to put it, in the way in which, from what's said elsewhere about Kipple, makes more sense, is that rather than there being more objects being introduced, objects that didn't previously exist that are Kipple, the idea is something more like when I leave Kipple somewhere, the previously non-Kipple objects, the objects that did have a use, become Kipple. And it's primarily this idea that I'm going to be focusing on. But in addition to that, there are a couple more interesting claims about Kipple. First is that we do have this possibility of what's called rolling the Kipple factor back. That is that while in the absence of human intervention, Kipple reproduces itself, with human intervention, there's a way in which maybe not individual objects, at least the environment as a whole, can be de-Kippleized. And then finally, which in some ways follows from those first two claims, that is that in the absence of human intervention, it reproduces itself, and that it is only with human intervention that objects and environments can be de-Kippleized. Given that in some point in the distant future we expect there to no longer be human beings, it seems pretty obvious that at that same point, right, everything will be Kippleized, because there'll be no one to roll the Kipple factor back. So that's the basic idea of Kipple as we get into Grand Stream of Electric Sheep. So in trying to understand this idea, I'm going to draw on the phenomenological tradition, specifically Husserl and Heidegger. So from Husserl, I want to take the notion of Sinngebung or sense bestowal. This is primarily going to come into play to understand what we might call the sort of normal case. That is to say, the fact that if I don't have any Kipple lying around, the environment in which I'm in, my environment and the objects in it don't spontaneously turn into Kipple, or at least we don't get that idea from the passage above that it is, only through there being some Kipple in the environment that other objects become Kippleized. And so in order to understand this idea, the fact that it's only under special conditions that objects become Kippleized, I want to look at this notion of sense bestowal, and particularly the way in which sense bestowal can function passively. So according to Husserl's later idealism, every object that exists exists only insofar as it has a sense or a meaning bestowed on it by consciousness. And this, under Husserl's later idealism, a transcendental consciousness. But I think in adapting this idea to understand Kipple, when we're mostly, we're talking about tools, other, objects which have a function, we can think about this as a function bestowed upon them in use by, actually empirical egos, rather than the sort of far-off transcendental ego. And I think it should be fairly plausible, even if we want to be realists in some strong way about, objects as they exist in a sort of, under the view of science, for instance, or something like this. It should be fairly plausible that so long as we aren't Aristotelians, that, that is in some way or another, only through their being agents that objects have functions, that they have the meaning of being for something. And so the idea in Husserl is that in a sort of primordial way, in my actually intending or thinking about or referring to an object, it gets set up with this meaning or sense. But the idea is that, when I stop looking at an object, it doesn't cease existing, or in our case, it doesn't cease existing as a pen. And so the idea is, in order to resolve this issue, we get this idea that the object is maintained as having its meaning not only through my actually intending it as such, but also through this sort of potentiality which I retain of returning to the object as having this meaning. That is to say, that's not just the actually intending of it as having a meaning which sustains it in existing in this way, but also this potentiality, and in that sense, the object is maintained and sustained by me as an abiding possession, even when I don't actively think about it. And so then that's the basic idea of Sinngebung or sense bestow, which I want to use, which sort of deals with the normal case when objects don't become Kippelized. But the question is then, what is the mechanism by which, when Kippel is introduced into an environment, the objects do become Kippelized, do lose in a certain way this sort of sense or meaning that they had as useful. And so in order to understand this, I want to draw a little bit on Heidegger and his notion of equipment or things ready to hand. And so the idea here is that, so for one thing, for Heidegger, obviously the emphasis is less on seeing theoretical perception and more on use. You get this idea that to use the, as a, sort of putting a Heideggerian view in Husserlian terms, we would say that the sense bestowal, the primordial sense bestowal of an object as equipment for Heidegger is not going to consist in looking at it and seeing it, but rather in actually using it. That is, a hammer is revealed, a hammer is a thing for hammering, and it's primordially revealed as such in the act of hammering. And the idea is that it has that use or function or meaning only in a context and not by itself. There's no such thing as an equipment. Equipment always belongs to a equipmental totality in which it has its function, and insofar as it exists as equipment, it also has its being, insofar as it has its function there. And so how does that, what's the relevance of all this for understanding Kippel? So the idea I want to put forth essentially is that when I so say I have an environment like a carpentry shop where everything has its function, everything has its place directed towards a total function, a total task of, assembling wooden objects, hammering them together, and so forth. And so the idea would be something like, when I introduce Kippel into the environment, when I, start to leave around old newspapers and candy wrappers and so on, that not only in a sort of more mundane way does that, make it more difficult to move around in the space and to organize everything and so on, but that also, in a certain way, it makes it harder for me to see the objects for what they are. That is that, when I see a clean carpentry shop where everything has its place, I can immediately see, oh, that's a hammer, it's a thing for hammering, those are nails, those are to be hammered in, and so on. But that when this sort of Kippel gets introduced, when there's just all this sort of junk laying around, my sort of seeing of the objects as equipment gets disrupted. And in fact, what I want to say, a stronger sense insofar as their sort of meaning as hammers or as nails or whatever is based on their place in that environment. Insofar as the sort of total flow of the environment is disrupted, their use becomes disrupted as well, and my possibility of returning to them as having that function is disrupted. So it's sort of like the view something like is that it's sort of passively maintained as having that meaning, but that when Kippel is introduced, that gets disrupted, and then it requires an explicit act of restoring that meaning, of placing them back into the context in which they are usable, which allows them to exist again as useful things rather than just as Kippel. That is, so then the disruption by Kippel of the totality of the environment that disrupts the sort of passive sustenance of the object as meaningfully constituted, and then requires an active intervention in order to restore that previous meaning that it had. And so then I also want to connect this to a little bit to something that Heidegger says about in the context of history, which is that when he's talking about the past, we get this idea that an object, in a certain sense, is past, not insofar as its sort of origin has a certain, distance for its point of origin in time, and versus the current time has a certain distance, right? That's not how we really measure pastness. Rather, how we should understand pastness primarily is the fact that that object had a place in a equipmental context that belonged to entities, that were constituted by persons in the past. And so the idea is something like that. It's, in a primary sense, it is that's, so to speak, the objects are tied to the environment, and the environment is tied to the persons, the Dasein, who use them towards some purpose. I'm sorry. I don't have. Apologies. I've not adequately prepared this portion of the presentation. I think that's sort of the basic idea that I wanted to get across, is this idea of the Kipple disrupting the environment, and the way in which that the objects are useful, or exist as useful only in that environment, and so in that sense they become Kippleized. And so in looking at the way in which the pastness of objects is tied to the pastness of the environment, which in turn is tied to the pastness of the Dasein who constituted them as being directed towards a purpose, right? I want to link that up towards this idea of the sort of total direction of the direction of, or rather this idea of the universe moving towards total Kippleization, which is namely that, if objects, in a certain sense, just this idea that we have affirmed here, the notion that objects exist as useful in a context relative to existing persons, and so in the absence of persons who project who project these, have these projects and project these meanings, that then everything would lose their status as ready to hand or as useful. And so we see this it connects to this notion of the future total Kippleization of everything in the universe, given the future non-existence of agents acting in it. So that's sort of the rough idea I wanted to get across for the sort of basic concept of Kipple, and then explain the way in which Kipple reproduces itself, and this sort of final ultimate state of Kippleization that the universe is moving towards, as well as this sort of the possibility of, through a sort of active restoration of the meanings that objects once had, of de-Kippleization, or of rolling back the Kipple factor, and the way in which this sort of all ties into the way in which the sort of introduction of Kipple into an environment can disrupt that environment and the meaning in which the objects in it had within that environment, and the way those are linked to that environment. And so then the idea would be talk a little bit just sort of moving forward. So two directions for moving forwards and further developing this idea would be to look at relations between what Dick talks about in Gender Between Electric Sheep and certain ideas in Marx. In particular, I think this idea of, we can talk about Kippleization and commodification, that is the transformation of objects that were use values or had functions into commodities or exchange values in capitalism are both a kind of loss of use of an object. This sort of, in both cases, the object loses the meaning that it had as useful. Difference, of course, being that in Kipple, they just sort of, in a certain sense, an object that's Kipple just kind of sits there, doesn't have something that it is for. Whereas when we consider objects as a commodity or as an exchange value, there's still a certain sense in which there's something that it's for, to be exchanged and so on. But I think there is still some interesting connections to be drawn there, and that in both cases we have this sort of loss of use going on there. And in both cases, I think you can argue it's through a change in the environment or the context in which the object is placed. That is, the same hammer being exchanged at the market versus the hammer being actually used. The physical hammer doesn't change, but the context in which it is placed does. And then the other direction I think which would be interesting to move towards is look at the relation that all of this has to Philip K. Dick's later, more explicitly religious work. Though it's already prefigured a little bit in Do Not Dream of Electric Sheep, when we get this exception of that is that when the entire universe is moving towards a final state of total absolute Kippleization, except for the upward climb Wilbur Mercer, who's the primary religious figure in the religion of that book. And I think there's some interesting parallels to be drawn there then with the notion of Kippleization and since bestowal and Husserl and talking about and the specific way of understanding God's creation of the world in Judaism, which is rather than as a creation ex nihilo, as in most Christian views, as the sort of shaping of matter, shaping or ordering of matter, which I think can be understood as a kind of sense bestowal. And so in that sense, we can sort of directly see the way in which the sort of divine acts of sense bestowal, as opposed to, that we have in addition to the human acts of sense bestowal, which sort of roll back the Kipple factor, we have this idea of the sort of divine sense bestowal, which first constitutes reality, and in which the sort of conflicting two forces of the sort of divine sense bestowal and the Kippleization, and drawing parallels with the divine there. So I see that's is that I believe that's my time. So thank you very much for listening.
I believe Mika left the entire conference, unfortunately. Our next speaker is Cassandra Gritzner, who will present a paper, What are Let's Plays? And with subtitle, Why would anyone watch them and what's the issue with curatory LPS? So Cassandra.
Sorry, just a second. It's loading right now. I'm not sure if you can see anything yet.
Unfortunately, not yet. Only your Google Chrome frame.
Let's give it half a second. It's kind of loading. It would look super garbled for me.
If you would like to, I may present your presentation, but you will have to tell me when to change the slides.
Yeah, maybe just a second, because right now my full screen is black, which is not that great. Sorry. Let's try this again, maybe. Sorry about that. You would think that after like 2 years of Zoom University, I would figure this out. Can you see anything now?
Yeah, now it's visible.
Awesome. Okay, that took way too long. All right, I'll just start then in that case. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm going to be talking about Let's Plays or short LPs. Kind of answer the question what anyone would watch them, talk a bit about like the present taxonomy, and then talk a bit more about curatorial Let's Plays. When I don't talk about the philosophy of video games, I just started my PhD at the Wittenberg Center for Global Ethics, where I focus on the imagination and the use of counterfactual thought in ethical decision making. That's surprisingly similar to a lot of the discussions that are kind of happening in like the philosophy of fiction and the way we engage with like imaginary or fictionist words. So that's kind of why I'm really interested in like digital aesthetics. But okay, let's start with the talk. So maybe just to frame this full presentation a little bit, answer the question, why even care about Let's Plays? So it seems like there is a lot of interest now, a lot of academic interest in video games and about video games and what video games can do culturally. But there's not much discussion about like voyeur gaming or like the process of watching other people play. So those are the Let's Plays, the LPs. There also seems to be kind of this connotation of watching a Let's Play being somewhat silly. So something that people might heard often is like, okay, why wouldn't you just play the game yourself? Why would you prefer watching somebody else play the game if you could just play it yourself? That's also something my mother would ask me a lot, but like that's a different story. I think this kind of gap between quite understanding why maybe watching Let's Play isn't silly, it's actually like a worthwhile time spent of the time, kind of stems from this overall lack of interest in voyeur gaming. So we don't really know much about it. There's not a lot of conceptual work on this thing. And that's where a lot of the ignorance might be stemming from. So today I kind of try to answer why watching Let's Plays might not be silly and might actually be worth your time. I'm going to discuss Wildman's taxonomy of the Let's Plays. It's kind of akin to the Waltonian like genres of literature just for Let's Plays, and kind of like 4 different ones, which we'll talk about a bit more. And then I'm going to try to frame the last one, the curatory LPs, as process arts, as those kind of are the most interesting in a philosophical sense. Maybe just like a really short crash course to answer what the Let's Play actually is. Maybe people don't know. So usually it's like a recording of a video game play session, which is often commentated, often live, not always. There's also sometimes like footage of the player reacting to the game that they're playing. It's a really big part of like the online gaming community. There's a lot of really dedicated fan bases, depending sometimes for specific games, sometimes for a specific Let's Player, with like full online sites, like for example Twitch, kind of being created to accommodate this interest. What's interesting is that like for a let's play, the playing is necessary. So it couldn't be a let's play without anybody playing, but it's not always the focus. So sometimes you kind of have somebody just playing as kind of like the backdrop activity, and it's more about like the commentary or the conversations that are kind of happening like on top of the game being played. So why watch LPs? I call these the boring reasons, not because they're like invalid or anything, but I don't think they're like philosophically very interesting. And I think the main one there is accessibility. So there might be like this financial accessibility, especially when we talk about like younger gamers who might simply not be able to afford a specific game. They might choose to watch a let's play to kind of interact with the game while not being able to pay for it. Then we kind of have like this physical accessibility, like, okay, like if I'm just not capable of like getting the game, or if I'm personally maybe not able to play the game, so maybe something like Dance Dance Revolution that like requires a lot of like physical movement. If I'm in a wheelchair, I might not be able to play it, but I might still receive some kind of enjoyment from the game by watching somebody else play. Geographical accessibility. Some games are only released in specific regions, so I might not be able to get it. And then the player accessibility. I talked about like some physical accessibility before, but I also think like a certain kind of mental accessibility is right. So maybe something like World of Warcraft, which requires a lot of time to be invested, might not be playable by a lot of like working adults who just don't have the time to actually put into the game. And they might still be able to enjoy the game through somebody else playing it a long time. The issue that I have with all these reasons is that they kind of render the let's play to be like a replacement for the actual game. Like if you're watching the let's play for accessibility reasons, you're not watching the let's play for the sake of the let's play, but just because like you would rather actually play the game, but for some reason you're not able to. That also kind of implies that like if you had a chance to like solve the accessibility, you know, if somebody bought the game for you, or you know, you were to gain the time, then the let's play would become super superfluous and you would no longer engage with it. And doesn't really seem to capture like the overall interest and the consumption of those let's plays that people are doing. So maybe let's try to find some reasons why you would want to watch let's plays for the sake of the let's plays. And I think that is something that is often done by finding aesthetic value within the let's play. So the basic idea is that like not all let's plays have the same kind of aesthetic value. There's different kinds. And Wildman tried to kind of make sense of those different kinds of aesthetic values within a let's play by providing 4 rough categories of let's plays. That would be like performance-based let's plays, theater-based let's plays, artworks as like let's plays as artworks, and then the curation let's plays. For the first 3, Wildman identifies like a really unique aesthetic focal point. However, the last one, the cursory let's plays, are still somewhat puzzling regarding the aesthetic value, and that's kind of where I tried to provide a new, unique focal point. But let's just briefly talk about the first 3. So a performance-based let's play derives its aesthetic value from the playing skill. So like the let's play is watched because the creator, the player, is very skillful at the game. So maybe it's like a speed run or like somebody who's like really, really good at a game. And there the focus is on the playing. I think this is the most akin to watching sports, where you're just able to appreciate the athlete, or in this case, the player, for being really, really good at what they're doing. Then there's like the theatrical let's play, where the aesthetic value seems to be derived not necessarily from the game, but from the creators or the player's entertainment. So the let's play is watched because the creator is funny or entertaining or educative. There may be like jokes, or they might be telling stories about their lives. Sometimes there's like political debates on top of let's plays happening. And these can be aesthetically valuable, but then the game is kind of in the background. So like what's important is less the game and more the creator engaging with the with the audience. And so there the aesthetic focus would be the commentary of the let's play. Then we kind of have the smaller category, or at least this rarer category, where the let's play itself is an artwork. So the aesthetic value is then derived from a larger work where the let's play is part of. And then the Let's Play is watched because of some larger project narrative. I have this example of the Terrible Secret of Animal Crossing, where a person wrote this some like a kind of graphic novel based on a Let's Play they had, where they kind of tell this big conspiracy theory about Animal Crossing and what the animals are doing. And so the game footage is kind of used to create something. I'm calling it artsy. There's a lot of options. So then the aesthetic value is actually derived from the Let's Play and nothing else. And something that's maybe a bit more difficult to identify would be the curatory Let's Play. So a curatory Let's Play provides a curated experience of the game. It's meant to show off a game. There might be some commentary that doesn't need to be. Often this commentary is anatory, or it tries to provide additional analysis. Often these Let's Plays might be happening with like developers, which is the case of this Let's Play of Deponia, where one of the developers is part of the Let's Play team, and they're talking about like the decisions they made. Or there might be Let's Plays that try to show off like all the text in a game, or all the animations, or all the graphics. So there, the focus really is the game, and that may be problematic, right? Like if we're looking for something unique in a Let's Play that is valuable, that we can't get from the game itself, but then the focus of the curatory Let's Play just is the game, then we might not really have enough of a difference between the game to identify something that makes it valuable all on itself. So some people might come to believe that, okay, like maybe the other three Let's Plays are fine, but at the very least in this category of the curatory Let's Play, you might just be better off playing the game. I'm trying to justify why there might actually be reasons why watching curatory piece is not silly. And to do that, we kind of need to find something in the Let's Play that we cannot find in the game on its own. However, if we are kind of looking for like this unique focal point in the Let's Play, but the focal point just is the game, it might seem that there is nothing unique in this Let's Play. There we go. Okay, so like, yeah, if you're watching a curatory Let's Play for the sake of the game, then you may as well play the game. There doesn't seem to be like anything unique between those two things, and I kind of want to question that. So the way I do it is to kind of frame the curatory Let's Play as a process art. To do so, I'm kind of placing the aesthetic focal point not within the Let's Play, but within the player or the viewer. So Nguyen wrote a paper where he points out that in some art forms, it is not the artistic artifact, so in this case, not the Let's Play, that is meant to be appreciated, but the audience's activity itself is appreciated. The examples he gives are rock climbing walls or cooking recipes. So when a rock climbing wall is designed, it's not about the rock climbing wall itself being very valuable in any kind of aesthetic sense, but it is about the aesthetic appreciation of the person climbing the wall. It's about, kind of being in touch with your body, trying to like push yourself over a certain limit. And that's also kind of true with like cooking recipes. When I'm writing a cooking recipe, my goal is not for the recipe itself to be aesthetically valuable, but kind of for the end result. So like for the dish, or maybe even the process of cooking, to be valuable within the person who's carrying out the recipe. So the artifact itself, so neither the rock climbing wall, the cooking recipe, or the Let's Play is created to be aesthetically valuable on its own, but to encourage some kind of valuable process in the person who's consuming it. So there's some similarities here. So both seem to, like both the Let's Play and the rock climbing wall aims to bring out something appreciable within the viewer, but also there's differences, right? Like a rock climbing wall is specifically designed to do so, while for Let's Play, it doesn't really seem to be the goal of the person creating Let's Play to make another person appreciate themselves. There also seems to be like, there seems to be a difference in temporal points. So I may be appreciating myself climbing the wall while I'm actually doing it, while for the Let's Play, it might be happening after I already watched it. And to kind of show this off, I would like to talk about an example with Enter the Gungeon, which is a video game. It's a like a twin stick bullet hell shooter. Has a really steep learning curve with like a high difficulty and a lot of random elements. There's like over 200 unique items. There's additional like guns and supports, and there's like a ton of combinations between the guns, the items, the streakers, and the unlockables. And that kind of leads to even the most dedicated players with like 500, 700, 800 hours of playtime not being able to see everything of the game. But by watching a let's play, a curatory let's play that aims to show off selected parts of the game, the let's play can aspire the audiences to start or to continue playing. So by watching a let's play, by seeing somebody else play through a cool element, you might be inspired to reach this cool game element on your own. You may be motivated to push through maybe more boring bits or more difficult bits because you've kind of seen the reward of it, and that can then recontextualize and heighten your own gaming experience. So watching the LP then increases the aesthetic value of the gaming experience within the player once they are playing the game. Of course, that only works if you first watch the let's play and you then play the game, but I would actually say it also kind of works in the more past sense, where if you first play the game and you then watch a let's play much later, you might still be able to heighten and recontextualize your experiences, because the kind of activity that is worth aesthetic appreciation doesn't necessarily need to be the process of playing. In the literature, we kind of see a really low barrier where deliberating, so like just thinking and engaging with your game or the gaming experience might be already sufficient to be aesthetically appreciative of your own engagement. So when you're watching a let's play of a game you've already played, may it be like a really old game or maybe a game from childhood, just kind of like being nostalgic might already be sufficiently aesthetically valuable to make the let's play aesthetic pleasing. So there's different kinds of audiences, therefore. So there's the audiences who first game and then they watch the let's play, or there's audiences who watch the let's play and then they game. And both of them kind of can find like an aesthetic value either in their nostalgia or in their heightened later game experiences because of the curatory let's play. The rough implications of that are then the curatory let's plays may have different aesthetic focal points depending on the person watching them. So for one person, it might be nostalgia, for the other, it might be the future heightened game experience. And then the curatory let's play also requires a certain level of engagement to be aesthetically valuable. It's not sufficient for you to just kind of like not pay attention to it and have it run in the background. You need to sufficiently engage with the medium to actually attain this aesthetic value. So in conclusion, I hope I showed you that let's plays can be aesthetically valuable and maybe not quite as silly as a replacement for the actual game at hand, but are actually valuable on their own. I've hopefully showed you that different kinds of let's plays have different aesthetic focal points, and that some let's plays create unique ways for an audience to engage with the source material by evoking aesthetic focus within the viewer. That's the main literature. Both the talk and the book are really, really good. I would recommend them, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for your speech. Currently, we have scheduled our last speech, but unfortunately, Matthew Gladen was unable to participate live. But he sent us a video with his speech entitled Interstellar Alliances, Cyberpunk Dystopias, and Fantasy Cosmogonies, the Fermi Paradox as a Key to Analyzing Speculative Fiction. After watching this video, we will have some time for discussion. So, Mateusz, could you please try to show it to all of us? Yeah.
Greetings to everyone. My name is Matthew Gladden, and I'm delighted to have an
Yeah, it is okay.
Greetings to everyone. My name is Matthew Gladden, and I'm delighted to have an opportunity to participate in PhilosophyCon. I would like to speak with you about the Fermi Paradox and how this real-world scientific and philosophical problem connects with Greetings to everyone. My name is Matthew Gladden, and I'm delighted to have an opportunity to participate in PhilosophyCon. I would like to speak with you about the Fermi Paradox and how this real-world scientific and philosophical problem connects with speculative fiction. As many of you know, the Fermi Paradox essentially says that if contemporary astronomy is correct in its account of how stars and planets arise, and if contemporary evolutionary biology is correct in its claims about how life evolves spontaneously through natural processes, then we should expect that life should have arisen on countless other planets. And not just life, but whole alien civilizations. Some scholars have suggested that if even one alien species were to develop spaceships that could travel at just 1% of the speed of light, then that species should be able to colonize an entire galaxy over the course of just 100 million years. So if contemporary astronomy and biology are correct, then when we look up into the night sky, we should expect to see a sky that's full of distant alien megastructures and starships in whatever direction we look. But in reality, after decades of intensive searching, we still haven't yet been able to detect a single piece of evidence of intelligent alien life anywhere else in the galaxy. I've simplified it somewhat, but essentially that's the Fermi paradox. Scholars have proposed dozens of possible solutions to the paradox. Some argue that we've simply calculated the probabilities incorrectly. Others argue that every intelligent species will necessarily develop the means of its own destruction and then obliterate itself. Others argue that we're looking for the wrong kinds of signals. We shouldn't expect advanced aliens to use radio waves for communication just because we use radio waves. Others argue that intelligent life forms eventually evolve beyond material existence altogether, which was a key element of the 1956 film Forbidden Planet. And yet other scholars argue that perhaps Earth is the focal point of the universe, that human beings are special, and we shouldn't expect there to be life on other planets. So what does the Fermi paradox have to do with fiction? Well, I would suggest that the paradox can be used to construct a conceptual framework for analyzing fictional works. For this purpose, we can formalize the paradox as containing three parts. Assertion 1 states that 21st century science suggests that countless alien civilizations have arisen on other planets throughout the galaxy. Assertion 2 states that 21st century science has found zero evidence of any alien civilization arising on any other planet anywhere in the galaxy. And because these assertions appear to be inconsistent with one another, we need a third part, a resolution that seeks to explain the apparent contradiction. So we can now classify fictional works according to the attitudes that they present toward assertions 1 and 2, and the sort of resolution, if any, that they propose. And we can start with a first category of works that simply offer no response to the Fermi paradox because they aren't even aware of it. This category includes romance novels, spy stories, and mysteries. What these works have in common is that they totally ignore the Fermi paradox. They're usually focused on interpersonal relationships between human beings and on the completion of some tasks within our mundane everyday world. In most such fiction, characters aren't even aware of assertion 1 or 2. They're not aware of the detailed claims made by 21st century science, and thus they live in a state of blissful ignorance. For them, the paradox isn't a concern. There is a second category of fictional works in which assertions 1 and 2 aren't yet true, and in which it doesn't make sense to discuss any sort of paradox. One such genre is that of historical fiction, like stories set in the Renaissance or ancient Rome. Here, assertions 1 and 2 are rendered inert because they make claims about what 21st century science tells us, and in such historical fiction, there isn't yet any such thing as 21st century science. Also in this category is early Earth-centered space opera, which presents an Earth that comes to interact with many alien civilizations. These stories originated in the early 20th century before contemporary astronomy and biology allowed the calculations that create the Fermi Paradox, so they don't address it. And indeed, some of these works even imagine that nearby planets like Mars or Venus are home to vast alien civilizations, because science hadn't yet ruled out such possibilities. Such early space opera includes the Flash Gordon and John Carter franchises. Also in this category is superhero fiction. The two largest comic ecosystems existing today, those of DC and Marvel, originated in the 1930s, before contemporary science confronted us with the Fermi Paradox. So they're similar to early Earth-centered space opera insofar as they couldn't deal with the paradox. Such franchises often present a multiverse with multiple Earths, multiple dimensions, and multiple timelines that all coexist. They're about fun and adventure rather than logical consistency. Rather than forcing themselves to make tough narrative choices between either or, they instead take a flexible both-and approach. Of course, new superhero stories should address the findings of 21st century science, but it's a bit too late for that. Their fictional universes are too well established, and they're essentially stuck in a pre-Fermi Paradox worldview. Now we have a category of fictional works that evade assertions 1 and 2 by being set in a mythical poetic space rather than a physical historical one. This includes works of high fantasy like Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. Such authors aren't obliged to deal with the paradox because high fantasy usually takes place in a quasi-medieval setting with only rudimentary science. So the Fermi Paradox isn't a question that characters can puzzle over. Indeed, characters may not even realize that their Earth is round. And often they're dwelling in a world that isn't meant to literally be Earth. Its land masses and seas are somewhat different. It's a sort of metaphorical Earth, not our literal Earth. Moreover, such stories typically feature forms of magic that violate the laws of physics. And by including magic, authors are indicating that this is a fictional world where science can't explain everything. Nevertheless, high fantasy authors often go to great lengths to indirectly address the spirit of the paradox because by nature they are cosmogonists, they're world builders. Many works of high fantasy incorporate some detailed poetic explanation of how their world came about and what it contains. And typically they propose a world in which an allegorical Earth is the center of the cosmos. Earth is unique, and we human beings are special, and yet we're not alone. However, non-human life isn't found on other planets. Either it's found in other kingdoms, in the Elven Kingdom, in the Dwarven Kingdom, or it's found in a sort of shadowy other world that exists intertwined with our visible world, the place where ghosts of the dead and demons dwell within these fictional worlds. Such high fantasy also often includes the concept of successive or cyclical ages or eons. We aren't alone because the world had other occupants in earlier ages, and it will have other occupants in future ages. So this is how high fantasy tends to deal with the Fermi Paradox. It offers not a scientific response, but a poetic one, a mythopeic one. A related case is that of contemporary supernatural fantasy and horror. These are tales occurring in the present day that feature entities like wizards, vampires, and werewolves. They might include a city named London that looks like London, but it's not the real London. These stories are set in a sort of magical world in which the laws of physics and biology don't get to dictate what is possible or impossible. And as a result, the Fermi Paradox is evaded. It's drained of all of its logical force. Another genre is what we might refer to as allegorical space opera. It's inspired by franchises like Flash Gordon and John Carter, but differs from them because its stories don't involve our actual Earth or any known star systems. Instead, they take place in some other imagined realm. Star Wars is the most prominent example of such allegorical space opera. Many of its main characters look like terrestrial human beings, but in fact they're not, and it's not making any claims about Earth per se. In this sense, it's similar to works of high fiction that take place in an Earth-like world that isn't quite our actual Earth. Like high fantasy, such allegorical space opera isn't obligated to consider the Fermi Paradox because the scientific evidence that its characters possess is very different from the evidence confronting us here today on Earth. Fictional works in our final category accept assertions 1 and 2, and they attempt to offer some rational explanation for how such seemingly contradictory facts could both be true. This category includes 3 types of fiction. The first is that of cosmic horror, the sort of weird tales authored by figures like H.P. Lovecraft. In a sense, it was preemptively addressing the spirit of the Fermi Paradox in the 1920s, before real-world science had made the paradox clear. In many cases, cosmic horror accepts assertions 1 and 2, and it resolves the paradox by suggesting that countless forms of life have arisen in the cosmos, but there are a few entities of unfathomable destructive power that obliterate whatever life arises. Moreover, these cosmic monstrosities often have weird geometries that make them undetectable to earthly science. This offers a fairly pessimistic solution to the Fermi paradox. It suggests that the destiny of human beings is to be consumed or driven insane by these cosmic entities, just as every other intelligent civilization was annihilated before it could leave any visible trace. This isn't a very pleasant vision, but it's noteworthy because it's one of the few cases where fictional works explicitly try to explain why the rest of the universe appears to be empty of intelligent life forms. Next is what we might refer to as contemporary first contact space-based science fiction. These works start with an Earth in which human beings haven't yet detected signs of intelligent life elsewhere, but over the course of the story, human beings detect such signs, and we have our first encounter with intelligent life from other worlds. The plot may even revolve around why we hadn't detected such life before, and how it has finally come about that we've made contact with alien civilizations. The Star Trek franchise falls into this category. Of course, the original series produced in the 1960s is set in the 23rd century when humanity already has knowledge of many alien races, but later installments in the franchise go back in time to explain how first contact came about. Star Trek also emphasizes the concept of the prime directive, which actually codifies the way in which well-meaning alien civilizations either conceal or reveal their existence. It suggests that our part of the galaxy is, for the most part, full of wise, friendly alien races who know it can be harmful to the development of an intelligent species if it learns about alien races before it's reached a sufficiently advanced societal state. And so alien races conceal their existence until they think an emerging species is ready for the encounter. This is a fairly optimistic resolution to the Fermi paradox. It accepts assertions 1 and 2 and resolves their apparent contradiction by saying that our 21st century science isn't quite advanced enough, but soon humanity will develop new technology that allows it to analyze and explore the galaxy in new ways, and then alien forms of intelligent life will suddenly be revealed, and we will rejoice at our new membership in this friendly galactic family. Other examples of such first contact sci-fi are the film and novel 2001: A Space Odyssey, the films Forbidden Planet, Contact, and Arrival, and the novel series The Expanse, some of which, however, are more pessimistic or ambiguous than Star Trek. And finally, we have certain types of cyberpunk fiction. One might not naturally associate cyberpunk fiction with the Fermi paradox because cyberpunk takes place on the near future Earth, and like romance novels or mysteries, it's concerned about concrete dynamics within our real world. It's wrestling with the relationship between man and machine, with the ethical problems of cloning and genetic engineering and advanced AI. It's grappling with ecosystemic collapse and the problems that arise when megacorps replace governments. Cyberpunk is concerned with what's happening to us right here on Earth, whereas the Fermi paradox is all about what's out there in the distant corners of the galaxy. However, cyberpunk fiction embraces the paradox in spirit and attempts to offer a logical resolution even without referencing it by name. More specifically, a recurring theme in cyberpunk is the blurred boundary between the real and the virtual, between the natural and the artificial. In cyberpunk, the human brain is something that can easily be manipulated through neurocybernetic technologies. It's possible to implant false memories, to create false perceptions. The world that we see around us may not be true at all. Thus, cyberpunk fiction offers a ready-made logical answer to the Fermi Paradox. If the scientific evidence available in our visible world suggests that alien life should be commonplace, but there is no such alien life in the visible world, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us that the whole world, the visible world, is fake. It's probably just a computer simulation, a sort of virtual reality in which we are trapped. In some cyberpunk works, apparent inconsistencies like that of the Fermi Paradox become a key element of the plot, a glitch in the machine that helps the protagonist recognize that the world is an illusion, and which starts the journey by which the protagonist will eventually break out of that illusion, that prison, to discover the real world that lies beyond it. Here we can make philosophical connections to Plato's allegory of the cave, to the evil demon from Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, and more recently to brain in a vat type thought experiments. In popular culture, such possibilities are explored in works like the Matrix film series and many of the works of Philip K. Dick. They may not reference the Fermi Paradox by name, but in spirit they take its implications very seriously. Out of the four categories, only the final one grapples with the scientific substance of the Fermi Paradox and attempts to formulate a rational explanation for it. However, that doesn't mean it's the only type of fiction that engages with the paradox on some level. Works like superhero fiction, high fantasy, and allegorical space opera offer a sort of response to the Fermi Paradox, but it's not a logical argument that attempts to rationally untangle the paradox. Rather, it's an emotional response that laments the fact that we appear to be alone in the cosmos as intelligent life forms. Star Wars and Lord of the Rings and superhero comics are saying on an emotional level, wouldn't the world be a more thrilling and mysterious place, a more romantic place, a more heroic place if we weren't so alone? Wouldn't it be fun to visit exotic alien worlds? Wouldn't it be exciting to have an elven wizard as a friend? This isn't about logically reconciling assertions 1 and 2. It's about imagining and relishing a sort of counterfactual world in which assertion 2 isn't true. So this concludes what I've prepared. Once again, I'm very grateful to have the opportunity to take part in this year's PhilosophyCon, and I'd like to thank the organizers especially, and to thank each of you who's participating in this really outstanding event. Jeszcze raz serdecznie dziękuję za możliwość uczestniczenia w PhilosophyConie. Greetings to everyone. My name is Matthew Gladden, and I'm delighted to have an opportunity to participate in PhilosophyCon. I would like to speak with you about the Fermi Paradox and how this real-world scientific and philosophical...
I can see you. So at first, maybe you have some questions to each other. Is it so? If not, I have a kind of linking question to both of you after hearing your speeches. What do you think? What is your impression? Is an experience of playing horror games in any kind similar or at the same level as watching LPs from these games?
Thank you for your question. Yeah, that is an interesting question. I think that watching somebody playing LP some horror game would just add some sort of additional level of mediation, because it adds another person between you as a player who experiences the game and you as somebody who observes another person play. I think that makes like a very significant shift, to be honest, and in the way of perceiving the game. So the experience of watching the game and playing the game would be different, I think, in this way.
Yeah, I would Sorry,
I
okay, cool.
I wanted to interrupt you. Okay.
Yes, I would agree with that. But like, I'm not 100% sure if it necessarily would be a worse experience. I feel that it would be very different from what it was intended by the original game designer. But I could also imagine at least that some audiences become very close to their favorite streamers. They may kind of build these parasocial relationships. And maybe if the person who's playing the game is somebody, even if you don't know them personally, somebody that you kind of care about, maybe them experiencing like the stress of playing a horror game, maybe that actually affects them more, if in a different way than you actually playing the game yourself.
Okay, thank you. So, as far as I understood, the experience of horror, of this thrill, is impossible to have through watching LPS. So, these movies, in a way, take something from this basic first-person impression.
I don't know. It's hard to say that it would be impossible to feel this thrill while watching Let's Play. I think that's just a little bit different genre in itself, sort of, because playing the game definitely has some, as I gave an example, like in my speech, I think that would also be applicable when we talk about Let's Plays and horror games, that when this marketing campaign of Dead Space was shown to the women who were expected to represent the gamers' mothers, for them the game looked a little bit different because they weren't playing the game themselves, so they didn't have the blaster in their hand, which makes the experience completely different. So you can shoot a monster, you're not just a victim. So with Let's Plays, I think that would also be a little bit different, just because this person in between, the person who's playing the game, who you're watching, at this level of mediation. So the person is, you're not being immersed in the game that much, but at the same time, some people who watch Let's Plays, they might not want to ever play a specific horror game, and they would only experience it through the streamer, for example, who plays Let's Play. So that's the big part of it.
Yeah, I'm definitely one of these people where like really scary games, I don't like to play them, but like they're still interesting and like they're interesting to me. So like watching Let's Plays and like being able to maybe skip through some sequences is one way I can experience them without kind of having to go through. I don't know. I really just like jump scares, so it's in the YouTube video you can kind of see that it's coming, so you can skip through it. I just would like to push back a little bit on this being a worse experience, right? Like I don't think it's necessarily subtractive. I think it's different. And I would agree that like you're not immersed in the game as much, but like depending on the social relationship that you're kind of building with the streamer, you might be very much immersed in this little metaverse that the streamer is kind of creating. But like, yeah, it's a very different experience, but I wouldn't necessarily say it's subtractive to like playing the game.
No, it's definitely not. But then, yeah, it's very interesting actually to think about horror and think about Let's Plays in horrors, because usually we think about from the first-hand experience, like the audience, and this additional level of affiliation that might actually influence some of the important dynamics that are present in experiencing monsters or in experiencing the suspense in horror films.
Okay, thank you. We also have some questions from our audience, both in our YouTube channel and at Place and Krakow. First question to Cassandra. I'm sending it through our chat. Could you please read this question and try to answer?
So the question is, do you think of any game that's audience has in-game possibilities to influence mechanics, enemies, or the like? I do think maybe not directly, but I do think that participation in Let's Plays is often possible. So on one hand, you might just have the creator, the player asking the audience to input for key decision making. So they might just ask like, oh, should I go this way or that way, or should I focus on this or that level, and kind of get input through this. But then it's still curated through the streamer. But I'm also thinking about maybe like those experiments, I'm going to call them, like Twitch Plays Pokemon, which was this Let's Play run a couple of years ago, where somebody wrote a code where people in the chat of Twitch could put in controls and the game would just randomly carry them out, or like whatever came first would be carried out. So it was actually like all of the audience kind of playing the very first Pokemon game together. And I thought that was really interesting because they had this very clear way of inputting like actual commands into the game. So like they were moving the character in a way, but they also built a really big lore. So because there was like thousands of people watching, a lot of the movements was very random. A lot of things happened that usually wouldn't want to happen, right? Like you lost a couple of battles, or you let go of your Pokemon, you released them, you couldn't get them back. And the people started like writing this narrative and creating those online communities where they would like write stories and fan fiction and make videos and like sad music videos about it, so that they're actually were able to like elevate their own input into like something even higher than the game itself could have provided.
Okay, thank you. We cannot have a discussion in its proper meaning, since I'm unable to connect to this. So thank you for this answer. And a question for Mark. I hope you can see it now. Mark, can you see the question?
Yes, I'm reading it now.
Could you please read it maybe for all of us? Thank you.
Do you think that using of monster characters in games as a form of justification for player violence? Obviously, there is a kind of dehumanization of characters, such as zombies. Historical ideologies, fashions often use such dehumanization procedures to justify the inhuman atrocities inflicted on other ethnic people. Let me start from the beginning. I think that there is a discussion actually regarding that, because monsters are always denied subjectivity in a sense. They are just objects that are to be killed, that are to be looted, and to be gained experience and gold from. And like this idea of the supermarket, so this entire design of the game landscape, for example, would be just like a supermarket, that it is filled with different kind of monsters that you can kill and get different profits from. That is just part of the game. And for example, some researchers who are engaged with the internal structure of the game worlds, they've claimed the impossibility to sustain these worlds, because monsters are just spawning non-stop, just like in supermarket. There is no like backstory behind that. They're just coming out of nowhere, and it produces this attitude towards resources that they can be non-stop just looted, that they're non-exhaustive in the design of the game levels. It's like that. So yeah, there is an unjustified killing of monsters, but the monsters in the game are not always allusions to some ethnic minorities. They are just monsters basically to be killed, just to make the game more entertaining. But of course, there is an important aspect that different methods to devoid humans of their humanity are present, and especially different different mechanics to make people to be monsters basically. And then when people are recognized as monsters, they are denied the right to be human. For example, very easy, just a serial killer. He can be a completely normal looking human being, a white middle-aged man, enjoying all kinds of privileges. But then he displays at some point some behavior of engaged in rampaging, killing the people. Then the person displays not visual monstrosity, just like he is not, he cannot be visually identified as belonging to any kind of minority, but at the same time, the person displays like psych behavior. And then the person is framed as monster. So yeah, framing some groups as monsters allows for excluding them from the normal society, sort of, and normality functions here as this policing line of what is accepted and what is not. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. But let me continue this question. Do you see any type of threat, or is it a kind of dangerous for you, this dehumanization that our audience, one of our audience asked about? It's a psychological question, of course, but I asked, do you see any kind of threat, or do you consider it to be dangerous, this kind of dehumanization that occur in games?
Well, dehumanization and killing of monsters in games are two completely different things, because it's one thing to dehumanize a concrete minority group, and the other thing is to kill a gaming algorithmic monster. These are like two very separate things, and we should not like mix them together. Yeah, they don't. Thank you. Okay. I hope I answered.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So unfortunately, I didn't receive any other questions. So I believe we may have a break now. Cassandra, Mark, thank you a lot once more.
Thank you.
Hope to see you in the further edition of the PhilosophyCon. So stay tuned. Thank you a lot.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a nice weekend.
Thank you. Have a nice weekend.
Cześć. No, u nas nie ma głosu dalej. Mateusz, nie ma na YouTubie głosu.
Jest tylko prezentacja. Okej, teraz się pojawił.
Jest. Widać, widać. Dalej nie słyszymy, Mateuszu. W sensie ciebie słyszymy z Zooma, ale nie słychać na transmisji niczego. Mamy tylko prezentację. Teraz jest. Teraz jest. gadać? No gadam. No bo wróciło, czekaj. Znowu nie ma?
Niech coś powiedzą.
Mówcie co. No mówię coś. Halo. Jest coś. Halo. Dobra, teraz coś jest. Teraz akurat na chwilkę wróciło, ale teraz znowu nie ma nic. Jest straszne opóźnienie. Ale chwila, bo was nie słychać. Moment, poczekajmy, czy to jest. Chwila, bo was nie słychać. A mnie słychać. O co chodzi? Będzie chwilę odbijać, ale testujemy. Mikrofon i no
dzięki,
ja
super,
tutaj
super
zmniejszam
panowie.
ogień, żeby
Rozumiem, że papierochy możemy palić. Nie ma problemu. Nie, najważniejsze, że jesteśmy. Czy my wobec tego możemy rozpoczynać? Możemy. Dobra. Możemy rozpoczynać. Wobec tego rozumiem, że gdyby był jakiś problem, to ktoś nam da znać, że my gadamy już do próżni. Tak? Pan Adam nas poinformuje. No to jedziemy. Proszę Państwa, to znaczy my się przenieśliśmy do innej sali, chyba już to pozwoliło nam uniknąć problemów technicznych. Ja w międzyczasie chyba zrozumiałem, o co chodzi. My teraz znajdujemy się na 4. piętrze Uniwersytetu Pedagogicznego w Krakowie, to jest Instytut Fizyki i no, w Instytucie Fizyki działa, w Instytucie Filozofii nie działa, co jest chyba dobrą, tak mi się wydaje, reprezentacją relacji między tymi naukami. Więc wszystkich zainteresowanych jakimiś wymiernymi efektami zapraszamy raczej do Instytutu Fizyki. A wszystkich innych do Instytutu Filozofii, bo tam też się ciekawe rzeczy dzieją w Instytucie Filozofii, natomiast niekiedy skomplikowane. I my chcieliśmy spróbować Państwa przekonać do tego, że o tych skomplikowanych rzeczach można opowiadać niekiedy w bardziej przystępny sposób, a niekiedy taki, który ujawnia w zasadzie niedostępne bez tego graficznego, wizualnego wsparcia konteksty. Natomiast ponieważ wiem, że chyba parę osób niepolskojęzycznych również się przysłuchiwało tym wystąpieniom, to ja może po angielsku w dwóch zdaniach się do nich zwrócę z taką prośbą, żeby wytrwały, bo chyba prezentacja będzie na tyle ciekawa, będzie pokazywała po prostu dobre praktyki oraz nasze praktyki, które chcemy poddać Państwu ocenie, więc na chwilę przeskoczę na angielski. So our presentation will be devoted to show some sort of examples of graphic representation of philosophical ideas that we find interesting and engaging and enabling us to show something more, something to dig deeper into those ideas and conceptions. And the presentation, I believe, will be self-evident because we're going to show some of the examples of such graphic works. Graphic movies, graphic novels, comic books, posters. At the end, we will show what we, both of us, are doing with our students, because I'm a philosophy teacher in Warsaw High School, and Konrad, he's a graphic designer and graphic artist as well, and we work in the field of philosophical education, so to speak. So please carry on, even though I will be speaking in Polish, so maybe you will be able to find some inspiration from the slides of the presentation. Wracając wobec tego już do języka polskiego i do głównego wątku, no to nasza zasadnicza intencja i intuicja jest taka, że pokazując graficznie jakieś koncepcje filozoficzne, można ujawnić więcej i można ujawnić coś nieujawnialnego w żaden inny sposób. No i wobec tego intencja jest taka, żeby to próbować robić i żeby próbować eksplorować ten obszar. Doświadczenie nasze jest takie, że wobec tego dobrze jest jakąś graficzno-filozoficzną współpracę zadzierzgnąć, jeżeli chce się tym zajmować. Zaraz powiem dlaczego. Nie jest oczywiście tak, że w naszym odczuciu filozofia bez takiej graficznej reprezentacji obejść się nie może. No ona jest zasadniczo działalnością pojęciową, filozofia, więc zdawać by się mogło, że można ją zasadniczo w takim jakimś medytacyjnym oderwaniu, jak na przykład Kartezjusz to robił, czy Augustyn, czy bardzo wielu filozofów w historii, w jakimś takim zwarciu umysłowym, najpierwotnie umysłu twórcy, potem odbiorcy filozofii, to się może odbywać bez żadnego zapośredniczenia w jakichś graficznych reprezentacjach. Natomiast zdaje nam się, że sama tradycja filozoficzna i historia filozofii pokazuje, że jest coś takiego w koncepcjach, stanowiskach, teoriach filozoficznych, które same nas w tym kierunku pociągają, no bo rezygnacja taka definitywna z obrazowego myślenia w filozofii w naszym odczuciu pozbawiłaby nas możliwości operowania jakimiś takimi wielopoziomowymi strukturami ontologicznymi, jak chociażby osławiona alegoria platońskiej jaskini, antropologicznymi, jak chociażby zdająca sprawę z kondycji człowieka ta metafora trzciny myślącej Pascala, epistemologicznymi. Cały ten sposób obrazowania odwołujący się do tabliczki woskowej, odciskającej się, my wiemy, to jest w tradycji empiryzmu genetycznego od Arystotelesa począwszy, czy koniec końców etycznymi. W ogóle całe myślenie dylematu etycznego jako pewnych dwóch dróg, jakichś rozdroży jest samo w sobie wymowne, dlatego chyba dylemat wagonika jest tak nośny, nie tylko ze względu na możliwość różnych podstawień w tym dylemacie, tylko on sam w sobie, ze względu na pewną rozjeżdżalność tych możliwych strategii, obrazuje na poziomie wizualnym zasadniczo samą konstrukcję dylematu etycznego. Przecież etyka jest stawaniem przed takimi torowiskami czy drogami, to już wiemy od tej osławionej przez Prodikosa wprowadzonej opowieści o Heraklesie na rozdrożach. Tym zasadniczo jest etyka. No więc zrezygnowanie z takiego obrazowego myślenia w filozofii pozbawiłoby nas możliwości operowania również takimi kontekstami. My mamy pełną świadomość tego, że platońska jaskinia jest czymś zasadniczo problematycznym w takim mówieniu, bo przecież Platon sam się obrazowania bał, sam przed tym obrazowaniem uciekał, a pomimo tego sięgał po te środki obrazowe, wiedząc, że one co prawda mogą nas oddalić od tej idealnej prawdy, a jednak potrzebował ich, żeby przywołać jakieś konteksty w tej niesłychanie w ogóle interesującej alegorii jaskini, która zasadniczo jest o bardzo wielu rzeczach, ale na takim bazowym poziomie to jest po prostu o reprezentacji, o tym, w jaki sposób idee reprezentują rzeczy, w jaki sposób my próbujemy w ten porządek reprezentacji się włączyć i coś z niego wyciągnąć sensownego. Druga nasza refleksja jest taka, że to nie jest łatwe zasadniczo. I my próbujemy to robić i nam to nie wychodzi. Czasami nam się wydaje, że wyszło nam coś fajnego, a potem się okazuje, że to nie jest fajne. Więc doprecyzowaniem chyba naszej tezy, że w ogóle warto tak pracować w edukacji filozoficznej, w filozofii, doprecyzowaniem tej tezy jest to, że rzeczywiście ta współpraca powinna być kompetentna. To dobrze jest, żeby ktoś świadomy graficznie, jakiś filozof świadomy graficznie takimi rzeczami się zajmował lub grafik świadomy filozoficznie. A jeżeli tak jak w naszym przypadku ani jeden warunek nie zachodzi, ani drugi warunek nie zachodzi, chyba to potwierdzisz, no to niezbędne jest po prostu zadzierzgnięcie jakiejś współpracy i próba ustalenia jakiegoś wspólnego gruntu tej pracy. Skoro nie jest to łatwe, to znaczy, że może to nie wyjść. Co to by miało znaczyć, że coś takiego nie wychodzi? No to znaczy, że z jednej strony wydaje nam się, że może być podwójne przesunięcie zakresowe, wystąpić niebezpieczeństwo. Z jednej strony coś może być nazbyt przeintelektualizowane i przesycone treścią filozoficzną i nie nazbyt wsparte jakimś graficznym kontekstem, a z drugiej strony coś może być wizualnie urzekające i porywające, a nie domagające w tym komponencie treściowym. Wydaje mi się, że to jest w ogóle ciekawy wątek, żeby się zastanowić. Ja wiem, że motywem przewodnim tegorocznych spotkań w ramach PhilosophyConu jest Duna Herberta i właściwie treść, prawda, tego dzieła. Natomiast no nie bez powodu tym się chyba zajmujecie w tym roku. Wydaje się, że urzekający wizualnie film za tym stoi i jakoś no, powracająca moda na tę lekturę, zawsze związana z jakimś takim hollywoodzkim hitem kinowym, blockbusterem. No więc dobrym pytaniem jest, czy urzekający wizualnie sposób podania tych treści głęboko filozoficznych, liczba wystąpień w ramach tegorocznego PhilosophyConu dotyczących tych filozoficznych kontekstów jest niezwykle imponujące. One się tam rzeczywiście w tej epopei znajdują. I czy wizualnie urzekająca reprezentacja filmowa tych idei, ona przydaje zrozumienia tym koncepcjom, czy może je poniekąd przytłacza? To nie jest dyskusja, którą ja bym chciał teraz otwierać, bo nie czuję się też co do tego nazbyt kompetentny, ale wydaje mi się, że jest to rzecz, którą i pytanie, które warto zadać i zostawić do odpowiedzi mądrzejszym od nas. My nie czujemy się na tyle kompetentni, żeby dokonywać jakiejkolwiek krytyki praktyk wizualnych. Nie chcemy mówić, co nie wychodzi i co jest nie okej. Raczej chcielibyśmy Państwu pokazać właśnie w tej prezentacji to, co w naszym odczuciu wyszło. Jeżeli Państwo mają odmienne zdanie, to chyba jest to jakaś płaszczyzna do dyskusji. No i coś na koniec wrzucić, coś, co my robimy i czy to wyszło, czy nie wyszło, to chcielibyśmy poddać Państwa ocenie. Zachęcić też do pobrania takiej publikacji, która jest dla nas takim kanałem no właśnie prezentowania jakichś tam rzeczy, które z dzieciakami w szkole robimy. To by było chyba tyle tytułem takiego teoretycznego wstępu i chyba myślę, że możemy odpalić prezentację, bo ja mam niestety predylekcję do gadania długiego, a już chyba 7 minut minęło od mojego gadania, więc może kliknijmy prezentację. Czy to jest ten moment, kiedy ja mogę poprosić o kliknięcie prezentacji? Teraz oczekuję, czy ona się przeklikała. Ona się przeklikała, proszę Państwa. Bardzo nas to cieszy. Na razie.
Dobrze, no więc
co to jest?
Co to jest? To pierwszą rzeczą, o której chcieliśmy wspomnieć, ja myślę, wydaje nam się, że jest to istotne, jeżeli chodzi o przede wszystkim warstwę wizualną, jak też i warstwę teoretyczną, warstwę intelektualną, jest Calvin i Hobbes, czyli strip komiksowy zapoczątkowany w latach 80. ubiegłego wieku. Autorem jest Bill Watterson, jak zresztą widać. Calvin i Hobbes jest to komiks, który pojawiał się w wielu krajach, w różnych magazynach, w periodykach. Później też pojawiał się w sieci. Natomiast co nas urzekło w tym, to chyba to, że autor doskonale potrafi połączyć warstwę wizualną i warstwę merytoryczną, warstwę filozoficzną, głęboko filozoficzną. Akurat przykład, który pokazujemy, jest chyba dosyć znamienny, bo jest to bardzo ciekawy strip poświęcony wartości etycznej, wyboru na etycznym teście tak naprawdę, bo Calvin, czyli ten mały chłopiec, musi dokonać, stanął przed wyborem, przed próbą wyboru właściwej drogi na etycznym teście. I co w tych stripach Calvina i Hobbesa przede wszystkim urzeka mnie jako osobę zajmującą się grafiką, to że jest tutaj przede wszystkim niezwykła oszczędność walorów graficznych, niezwykła oszczędność tego, w jaki sposób operujemy tutaj kształtem, operujemy formą, a jednocześnie jest ona skrócona do takiej ilości, żeby wartość merytoryczna, wartość właściwa, czyli ta wartość, którą chcę przekazać poprzez dymki, poprzez tekst, poprzez to, co jest treścią tego komiksu, bo przecież w końcu to nie jest, treścią nie jest obraz, tylko tak naprawdę w tym wypadku jest to wartość właśnie obrazowi dodana. Wydaje nam się, że jest to przykład bardzo dobrego zharmonizowania tego, co ma być pokazane i co ma być powiedziane.
No ja też jestem wielkim wielbicielem tego, całej tej serii. Akurat ta konkretna plansza jest głęboko urzekająca. Tam pewnie nie można tego na YouTubie do końca przeczytać, ale można to namierzyć. Warto po to sięgać. W ogóle komiksy są fantastycznym medium Nie wiem, czy my możemy polecić wydawnictwo jakieś?
Nie mam pojęcia.
Chyba możemy. No to
No tak, zdecydowanie jednym z ciekawszych wydawnictw polskich, bo jakby w tej przestrzeni się głównie obracamy, no to jest Kultura Gniewu, czyli wydawnictwo pewnie może niektórym z Państwa znane. Wydaje nam się, że wartość prac, które są tam przedstawiane jest nawet
bardzo wysoka.
Tak.
I że są komiksy, są powieści graficzne, czyli takie bardziej rozbudowane formy. Tego naprawdę jest dużo i to jest niesłychanie ciekawe i z naszego doświadczenia edukacyjnego bardzo inspirujące i wciągające i angażujące też młodzież, bo pokazujące idee filozoficzne w takim bardziej właśnie graficznym kontekście. Poprosimy o przerzucenie slajdu. Czyli Instytut Fizyki łączy się z Instytutem Filozofii. O, bardzo dziękujemy. Proszę Państwa, Philographics, czyli z mojej perspektywy niezwykle istotne i przydatne narzędzie w pracy nad terminologią filozoficzną. Konrad zaraz trochę opowie o tych walorach graficznych, tego ja powiem, o co chodzi. Ganis Carreras to taki grafik, który zajmuje się, działa w obszarze w ogóle projektowania takiego plakatowego, ale z reguły są to prace orbitujące jakoś dookoła tematyki filozoficznej. Być może Państwo mogą też kojarzyć taką publikację, która wychodzi chyba pierwotnie w Australii, ale potem ją można namierzyć, czy to ściągnąć sobie, zamówić subskrypcję, prenumeratę, nie subskrypcję, prenumeratę albo namierzyć zawsze w Anglii, tam w co większych jakichś księgarniach można namierzyć, nazywa New Philosopher. Jest pomyślane trochę tak, oczywiście gra tym takim wątkiem New Yorkera, więc zawsze okładki są fajnie zaprojektowane, imponujące i on odpowiada za projektowanie każdej właściwie okładki tego New Philosophera, którego również Państwu bardzo polecam. To jest taki magazyn filozoficzny. Ale oprócz tego zrobił taki cykl grafik poświęconych pojęciom filozoficznym, nazwał to Philographics. Państwo tutaj mają parę przykładów.
Philographics, no cóż, mam nadzieję, że to będzie widać, że z filozoficzników i w naszym projekcie prywatnym, tak, można tak to nazwać, troszkę się inspirowaliśmy pracami Carrerasa i tak na pewno było. Philographics przede wszystkim chodzi o oszczędność formy. Oszczędność formy jest chyba najważniejszym elementem tych prac. One rządzą się swoimi jakby prawami, nie tylko Carreras korzysta z najprostszych możliwych schematów ikonograficznych, przecież tak naprawdę operuje tylko ikonami, on operuje podstawowymi kształtami, które układa w sposób taki, żebyśmy na pierwszy rzut oka one mogą niewiele znaczyć, natomiast po przeczytaniu tego, czego dotyczy ta grafika, jakie jest to pojęcie filozoficzne, nagle układ, który prezentuje Carreras, nabiera zupełnie innego znaczenia. Doskonale operuje kolorem, który podkreśla, uwypukla, dodaje pewnych walorów każdemu z zagadnień filozoficznych, o których opowiada przez tę grafikę. Te wszystkie grafiki są dostępne na jego stronie. Wydaje mi się, że świetnym takim ćwiczeniem mentalnym może być przejrzenie sobie tych grafik i spróbowanie zrozumieć bez czytania tego, czego to dotyczy, bo naprawdę jakby jakość, walor techniczny tych prac jest bardzo wysoki. No i oczywiście z mojej branży typograficznej też podziwiam chęć korzystania bardzo konsekwentnego z typografii, która jest również zaprojektowana na potrzeby tego cyklu, tego kanonu.
Prosimy o przerzucenie slajdu.
Dobrze, to ja się teraz poprodukuję tylko chwilę też, bo jest to przykład zupełnie inny, więc wracamy sobie z pracami. Idziemy w kierunku kinematografii. Film It's Such a Beautiful Day został nakręcony, zmontowany, zaprojektowany przez Dona Herzfelda w 2012 roku. To jest screen, jedna klatka tak naprawdę tego filmu. Ciężko jest opisać ten film w jednym słowie, w jednym zdaniu. Myślę, że tak naprawdę jest to bardzo głęboko filozoficzne dziełko, bo jest to film mało znany, można go gdzieś tam w Vimeo obejrzeć, nawet można go kupić. Jest to film, który opowiada historię Billa, który pochodzi z rodziny dotkniętej dosyć ciężkimi schorzeniami mentalnymi, umysłowymi. Bill zaczyna zapominać, kim jest, zaczyna zapominać, z jakiego środowiska pochodzi, zaczyna nie rozumieć świata, w którym żyje. Prowadzi do niezwykłego finału. Oczywiście nie będę zdradzał, mam nadzieję, że ktoś z Państwa będzie zachęcony tą krótką recenzją i spróbuje go znaleźć, obejrzeć. Jest dostępny, tak jak mówię, z tego powinno być problemu. Jakie filozoficzne aspekty tego filmu wyłapać można na samym początku już? Wydaje mi się, że jest to głębokie pokłady humanizmu, tego w jaki sposób człowiek postrzega drugą osobę, w jaki sposób postrzegamy same siebie. Jest to film głęboko egzystencjalny, szczególnie pod koniec, kiedy zaczynamy już rozumieć, co tak naprawdę chodzi. Jest to animacja, więc też trzeba wziąć pod uwagę, że dla osób, które raczej z tego typu rozwiązaniami nie mają dużo wspólnego, mogą być nieco nużące, natomiast wydaje mi się, że jego konstrukcja i długość 60 parę minut, tłumaczę się wiele dokładnie, one powinny tym osobom, które są mniej cierpliwe, kompensować to, że jednak wartość, którą gdzieś doniesie podskórnie, jest warta, wartość jest warta. Jest to warte tego, żeby te 60 parę minut temu filmowi poświęcić. No i przede wszystkim to, że zrobiła to jedna osoba, która miała do przekazania naprawdę dużo i po obejrzeniu tego sądzę, że większość osób zastanowi się też jest w stanie zastanowić się nad własnym życiem, nad własnym przemijaniem, nad egzystencją jako taką. Świetny przykład reprezentacji filozofii za pomocą, tak jak widać, kilku kresek.
Ja tylko dodam, że oczywiście ten kontekst tożsamości też przewija się przez ten film jako właśnie jedno z głównych zasadniczo pytań filozofii. Możemy poprosić o przerzucenie slajdu.
No tak, to jest z kolei przykład właśnie, nie nazwą tego komiksu, tylko raczej powieści graficznej. Pan Żarówka, polska produkcja, jeżeli ktoś zna, to będzie wiedział, o czym jest, natomiast w skrócie zupełnie bardzo, bo jest to powieść, w sumie dosyć rozległa, jeśli chodzi o objętość. Jest to historia chłopca, który próbuje w swoim dorastaniu odnaleźć siebie, odnaleźć kim ma się stać. Ma problemy rodzinne, które są bardzo absurdalne, przydają tej całej opowieści bardzo dużo surrealistycznego charakteru. Czyta się to niezwykle, ogląda się niezwykle, bo znów mamy tutaj bardzo fajne, bardzo trafne wyważenie wartości graficznej i wartości merytorycznej. Przede wszystkim, jeśli chodzi o filozofię, mamy tutaj dużo odniesień również do humanizmu, na pewno do kondycji człowieka, do kondycji ludzkiej, do tego, w jaki sposób możemy postrzegać siebie na tle innych, na tle rówieśników, na tle osób również dorastających, borykających się ze swoimi problemami i przeskakujemy do filozofii.
Bardzo dobrze. Dziękujemy za to przerzucenie slajdu. Właśnie już mieliśmy rozmawiać o filozofii. Czyli publikacji, którą wydajemy w mojej szkole z moimi uczniami i absolwentami i jakimiś zaprzyjaźnionymi osobami. 5. numer wyszedł w zeszłym roku, w tym roku wyjdzie, mam nadzieję, 6. To jest raz w roku jakoś zbieramy jakieś tam takie nasze kreatywne rzeczy, które nam się udaje zrobić, jakoś nawiązać do różnych tak naprawdę typów materiałów gazetowo-magazynowych. Pojawiają i teksty, i eseje, i opowiadania, i wywiady, i reportaże. Natomiast ogromnym kawałkiem tego jest jakaś próba łamania konwencji i sięgania po takie też graficzno-kreatywne sposoby prezentacji. W tym roku udało nam się dorzucić do tego zestaw gier, do którego bardzo byśmy Państwa chcieli zachęcić, żeby pobrać od organizatorów. Jeszcze o tym powiemy. Natomiast ja bym Konrada poprosił parę zdań na temat okładek filozoficznika, bo jak Państwo widzą, one też zachowują jakoś pewien porządek.
No tak, chcieliśmy przede wszystkim zachować spójność, jeśli chodzi o formę tych okładek. Postanowiliśmy, że skoro jest to magazyn, rocznik poświęcony myśleniu, no to co innego pasuje bardziej jak mózg, który na różne sposoby staramy się za każdym razem eksploatować. W tym roku wyeksploatowaliśmy go do słoika, tak?
Nie, wybuchowy.
Wybuchowy, tak. Wybuchowy.
Słoik w zeszłym roku mózg na kwarantannie. Ale trochę to gra z mózgami w naczyniu, prawda, Putnama. Więc dodaliśmy do tych mózgów w naczyniu tę kłódkę, że to jest takie zamknięcie trochę.
No tak, tak jak mówiłem, oszczędność barwy, myślę, że nie chcieliśmy eksponować niczego zbyt mocno na okładkach, ponieważ wartość też jest wewnątrz. Okładki mają tylko w jakiś sposób zachęcić, zainteresować, pokazać to, że co można robić.
Poprosimy o przerzucenie slajdu. Filozoficzniki, one są, drukujemy, one są też oczywiście w wersji cyfrowej. W internecie się googlują, chyba całkiem nieźle i na iściu można je sobie przeczytać. Niekiedy mamy jakieś ciekawe od naszych uczniów prace graficzne. Tutaj jedna praca Julii Gatys, druga Heleny Kendry. Wydaje nam się, że cytat filozoficzny, jakaś sentencja filozoficzna jest niezwykle inspirująca do poszukiwań formy plakatowej. Nie samo pojęcie, znaczy pojęcie również jak u Carrerasa w Philographics, ale też jakaś mocna sentencja, jak Państwo widzą. No tutaj trochę gramy Rolling Stonesami, Hela zagrała Rolling Stonesami, no ale te granice świata rzeczywiście w tych granicach języka się znajdują. Czy takie dosłowne przedstawienie cytatu ujawnia głębszą myśl Wittgensteina? No w naszym poczuciu zdecydowanie tak. No i ten cel naszej wędrówki też gdzieś tam się pojawia już w takiej mniej rysunkowej formie, a bardziej graficzno-komputerowej, więc tak nam się wydaje, że to są akurat takie prace niezwykle inspirujące. Gdybyśmy mogli poprosić o przeskoczenie o jeden slajd. No bo tam jeszcze coś będzie o wolności. Przyczynek do wolności to taki jakiś materiał, który nam się udało z uczniami podczas lekcji, gdy trochę nad egzystencjalizmem się zastanawialiśmy. I kiedyś wymyśliłem, że trzeba jakoś tę wolność spróbować sobie i u Sartra, i u Jaspersa rozłożyć na czynniki pierwsze. Ale uznałem, że jakoś zabawimy się postmodernistycznie i poprosiłem uczniów o sporządzenie ich definicji, a potem rzucaliśmy kośćmi, ażeby ustalić, które zdania z czyjej definicji złożą się na naszą zbiorczą definicję. Więc wprowadziliśmy jakiś element pozornej przypadkowości w rzucie kością, a być może właśnie jak najbardziej dobitnej i ujmującej konieczności wynikającej z determinacji ruchu ręką, ocierania się kości o stół, odbijania się i że to wszystko można fizycznie wyliczyć. No i na koniec uznaliśmy, że brakuje jakiegoś graficznego wzmocnienia tej pracy, a jako że gdzieś tam na horyzoncie też tych naszych rozważań nad wolnością Berlin się pojawił, to uznaliśmy, że niezwykle charakterystyczne rozległe czoło Berlina, no chyba najbardziej urzekające i świdrujące oczy w historii filozofii Jean-Paul Sartre i naprawdę zafrasowany podbródek i usta Karla Jaspersa mogłyby ten kolaż definicyjny uzupełnić jakimś kolażem graficznym. No i wyszło nam coś takiego, Konrad się nad tym napracował, bo to niełatwo jest z czoła Berlina, oczu Sartra i ust Jaspersa zrobić takiego golema filozoficznego. Niby to jest żart, prawda? My trochę zagraliśmy tutaj jakimś żartem. Natomiast czy można w lepszy sposób pokazać, że w gruncie rzeczy, a mam wrażenie, że zwracam się do filozofów w większości, zarówno zawodowych, jak i niezawodowych, czyli osób, które podejmują po prostu filozofię jako zajęcie. W gruncie rzeczy wszyscy jesteśmy filozofami, ale niektórzy w uświadomiony sposób, więc zwracając się do uświadomionych filozofów, czy aby przypadkiem nie jest tak, że my w naszych filozofiach, w naszych poszukiwaniach również jesteśmy takim kolażem. Tu trochę Wittgensteina na czole, tu za uchem jakiś Sokrates przycupnął, tam gdzieś takie nozdrza mamy przesiąknięte filozofią tomistyczną. No nie wiem, jakie inspiracje czerpiecie ze studiowania filozofii, ale poniekąd tak jest, że my jesteśmy trochę takim zlepkiem, takim właśnie golemem filozoficznym. No i po prostu ten kolaż pozwala nam to pokazać. Poprosimy o przerzucenie slajdu. To będzie ostatnia rzecz, którą my chcieliśmy Państwu pokazać, czyli te wspomniane gry, które w tym roku zrobiliśmy. One są wydrukowane z takim zamysłem, że można je wyciąć nożyczkami, są tam pasery takie do cięcia. No i jest planszówka, gramy trochę takimi sprawdzonymi metodami i adaptacjami sprawdzonych gier towarzyskich. Jest filabu, czyli filozoficzne tabu, termin, na który trzeba naprowadzić i zakazane słowa. Jest filozoficzne memory łączące filozofa z cytatem. Jest planszówka, figa, w której no, różne rzeczy się dzieją. To trzeba przeczytać zasady, które są w publikacji zamieszczone. No i chyba największe przedsięwzięcie, czyli Filozomber. Gra karciano-strategiczno, RPGowo, matematyczno, nie wiadomo jaka, w której chodzi o to, ażeby jak się jest filozomberem, ażeby zarażać filozoficznymi objawami, a jak się jest zdrowym człowiekiem, tudzież medykiem, ażeby tego zarażenia uniknąć. Zasady są niesłychanie skomplikowane. Nie wiem, czy to Państwa zachęca do sięgnięcia w tą grę, ale na pewno niewątpliwym sukcesem jest przedstawienie paru 10 stanowisk filozoficznych pod postacią jakichś objawów filozombizmu. No i Konrad tu się narysował i naprojektował. Może w 2 zdaniach.
Nie, no zrobiliśmy identyfikację właściwie wizualną dla całej tej serii gier. Staraliśmy się z racji tego, że było to nauczanie hybrydowe i robiliśmy to w takim dosyć dziwnym i nie do końca dla nas też zrozumiałym trybie, to też chyba wyszło na to, że forma tych gier też jest do końca, może dla nas nawet niezrozumiała, nieco dziwna. I forma graficzna również jest dosyć szorstka, ale taka miała być, jakby nad tym pracowaliśmy. Wydaje mi się, że nam wszystkim chyba, uczniom, z którymi pracowaliśmy, mam nadzieję też, że jeżeli są jakieś niedostatki warstw graficznych, to uzupełniamy je warstwą filozoficzną i z drugą stronę też, jeżeli jest coś, czego filozoficznie nie udźwignęliśmy, może udało się to jakoś dorysować albo
zaszpachlować. Tak. No i oczywiście tu ogromna robota naszych uczniów, bo my to robiliśmy w ramach takiego całorocznego projektu. Jeden z nich nawet dzisiaj z nami tu przyjechał, pozdrawiamy bardzo serdecznie Maćka. To jest ich wielka robota, oni się w to zaangażowali, oni to wymyślali, pomagali nam w szkoleniu, w opisach, w pisaniu zasad, w ogóle w wymyślaniu tych zasad, więc takie jest jakieś nasze wspólne dzieło. Czy ono jest fajne? Tak jak powiedziałem, na początku prezentowaliśmy naszym zdaniem dobre praktyki. Naszych praktyk nie jesteśmy w stanie ocenić. Gdyby Państwo byli zainteresowani, to my 30 egzemplarzy tej publikacji z tym zestawem gier do wycięcia przywieźliśmy. One są u organizatorów. Jutro może je można pobrać jeszcze w ramach tutaj spotkań w Krakowie, ale jeżeli zostaną, to one pojawią do Katowic i tam też je można będzie pobrać, a całość publikacji jest w ogóle w internecie, więc można też filozoficznik sobie zgooglować i obczajać. I jeśli mieli jakieś pomysły, co to można robić, to piszcie też do nas, dawajcie znać. Albo byście robili coś takiego sami, to my jesteśmy otwarci na współpracę. Kiedyś z Filozofikiem, taką gazetą współpracowaliśmy, która powstawała w oparciu o warsztaty filozoficzne z dzieciakami w przedszkolach i w klasach 1-3, więc takie rzeczy się dzieją. Z naszej strony to jest tyle. Tam jest ostatni slajd taki, dziękujemy bardzo i nisko się kłaniamy, więc poprosimy o, jak już jest, to dajmy mu również zaistnieć. O właśnie, on tak wygląda. Bardzo dziękujemy i bardzo dziękujemy organizatorom, bo gdyby Państwo wiedzieli, co myśmy tu musieli zrobić, żeby to było możliwe, żebyśmy mogli do Państwa przemówić, no, sztab ludzi był zaangażowany w tę prezentację i bardzo serdecznie im dziękujemy za tę możliwość. I kłaniamy się nisko. Marcin powiedz.
Skoro więc o tym dziękuję.